Good evening, and welcome to our next Rebellious Research seminar series with one and only Professor Simon McKerrell. So I'm going to do, Simon, just pass it to you straight away. If you don't mind just giving us a brief introduction about your background. The next hour is yours, and I will come back with questions and discussion towards the end. Thank you, Simon.
Sure, thanks, Agatha. It's really a delight to be here, and a huge thanks to you. I know how much colleagues really value this series, the Rebellious Research series, and I think it's a great job, to actually keep this going and to get speakers lined up. So I want to really say that, and I want to thank you for inviting me to speak. I'll try not to go on too long. I'll share some slides. No music, I'm afraid, for these ones. So I'll share some. I'll just share the window actually, and see how that goes. If I can set it up. Yeah. So are you guys seeing that okay, yeah?
It's fantastic, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, right, I'll just jump straight in then. So today's presentation is on Your Music is Not My Music, Practice Research for Disciplinary Renewal in Media and Music. So this is an area that I'm quite deeply engaged in and personally attached to, practice research in media and music. And of course, I come from a background of music studies in between disciplines, between media, music, semiotics, and so on. And I'm just going to start off. I think it's worth giving you a sense of who I am, just to get a sense really of where this is coming from and how I've ended up with some of these ideas. And I'm quite keen to hear from others as well. And I know that, having talked to lots of colleagues, that we've got film, music-y people, mixed media, audio, visual, all sorts in the discipline. So I think what I've tried to do in framing this is to think about practice very broadly conceived. And what's really interesting me is the potential here for practice to make a significant impact for the broader disciplines of music and media studies over the next 20 years, 30 years. My feeling is that really now is really the kind of conflux of a lot of things that will allow practice research to really become much more central to the disciplines across, which I'm talking about today. So who am I? What's my own journey? So there's, very, very briefly, there's a couple of pictures of me there. I had a very, very traditional upbringing in bagpiping in Scotland. As a child, I spent hours and hours and hours, weeks and months practicing to play the bagpipes. And I still sometimes do. I play every week still in a session, but during my sort of early adult years, I was playing a lot, and that led me essentially to becoming a professional musician. My first degree was in music, and then I became a professional musician after that, touring internationally and recording. There's some of the albums that I recorded around that time, my 20s and early 30s there. So what then happened was that I knew that, for me, I was always interested in research, and I won't bore you with a big long story about my biography, but essentially what happened was I moved into doing fairly quickly a PhD in music. And I moved at that time around, 25 years ago, into text, and picked up all of the reading, all of the literature review that you do in your PhD. And that really was quite a transformative experience for me. What that meant over a period of about 5 or 6 years, maybe 7 years, was that I moved away further and further and further away from performing and recording. But I kept it as part of my as part of my CV, if you like, and was still playing professionally for a number of years. But then as time marched on and things changed and jobs came along, and work came along, I really got much more heavily involved in just straightforward textual research. So I think what then happened to me was, after a period of about 12 or 15 years, I really realized that I needed, as part of who I am, to be back playing again and to be thinking about it in a much more focused way in terms of how could it contribute to playing, because I'd spent years writing about music and writing about the semiotics of sound and how that works in multimodal communication. So my specialty became, in one sense, became understanding conflict and division through social semiotics and multimodality. And I wrote various things in that area and collaborated with lots of great people, and that's kind of, half the joy of all of it. But then I really felt in myself that, the focus on sound as media and the focus on performance really sort of demanded that I actually start to incorporate again music and musical practice, because I realized, I think, that there was something in that was personally really, really valuable to me, and also to other people. And that was what really spurred my interest in practice research and starting to think about, well, we communicate textually, we're putting all this knowledge into text, we are essentially translating from one domain of experience to another. And I think that's a very common story for practitioners who move into university settings, much more common than at first I realized, for filmmakers, for poets, for artists, for musicians, and so on. And what that kind of led me down the path, which I'm going to talk about a bit today, was this sense of emic resistance. And by that, what I mean by emic resistance is essentially a reluctance, personally, to begin to delve into, explain, or engage in explanations in text of deeply felt aesthetics of traditions. So for me, this was really visceral, because I had been brought up as a child playing and performing bagpipes, and I still do, and I have lots of friends in that musical world. But you don't, if you're in the performing community, or if you're in a genre of practice, you don't tend to talk about the research dimensions of that would be interesting for people outside of that world and across different genres of practice. And that's kind of what I want to address today, essentially, is what sort of epistemological positioning is really useful for us to kind of make the practice research speak across genres and outside of canonical disciplines to other people who are in radically different areas of practice. And I think that's a really key area for us all to be thinking about. But that's kind of just a wee sense of who I am. And if you want to actually listen to some of my music, there's a website with some of the music on it, which I'm not going to go into now, but it won't be to everybody's taste. Okay, so media and music have always involved performance and practice, right? So, that's kind of stating the obvious. Music particularly, I think media studies, but music itself as well, it's really interesting, the position and the ways in which it has changed significantly since the 1990s and moved quite far, I think, since the 1990s. Working as a practitioner in a university setting, as other people in this series have said, sets up a tension. It sets up a tension between text and practice and so on. And there's lots of different ways to negotiate that tension. But one of the things I think that are important to note about that tension is that epistemologically, media studies, musicology, ethnomusicology, which was my home discipline originally, is predicated on some key ideas. And some of those ideas are, for instance, the absence of a core canonical repertoire. So what that means, certainly for musicians, is that if you are looking anthropologically or sociologically at a particular community of practice in music, whether that's pop, to grunge, to folk, to whatever it happens to be, classical, then you're essentially dealing with a tradition that has a canonical repertoire in the middle of it. And that is how practitioners understand their practice. And this is the same for documentary makers, for poets, for filmmakers, and so on. If you're involved in creative practice, you do understand quite somatically and in an embodied way how those things, the tradition that you've come from, particularly important pieces over the years that have inspired you, and when you do your own practice, you're thinking about how you are going to contribute to that trajectory in time of that canonical repertoire. Now, the absence of a canonical repertoire, if you're going to contribute practice research across different arenas of practice, is one of the very substantial core things that we have to think about and solve for practice research to become interculturally significant. The other thing to me that's really there in both, particularly in anthropologically inclined disciplines and some sociological approaches to media and to music, is relativism. And now relativism really, of course, absolutely key, not just to the epistemological traditions, but it's also, in some senses, there is a political dimension to this as well, for the disciplines to take insider knowledge on its own terms, and not to project, say, for instance, Eurocentric or Western-centric models of thinking about practice and performance into other areas. So that's a biggie as well. I think the other thing for me, coming back to performance later on, is to kind of consider what constitutes new knowledge, and of course, the whole discourse of the formal ref and research and so on, which meant quite a discipline build up of some really interesting approaches, both philosophical and also practical as well, in some senses, to understanding what constitutes practice research. And that's still something that's being fairly widespread agreement about how I think that happens. The other thing I think I want to talk about today is this sense of emic resistance, which I call essentially that reluctance to talk about your practice. And you really do notice this. I'd be interested what others think about this, but certainly in my experience in music, I don't know if it's the same in film and in artistic research areas, but there is a real resistance to that, because it is essentially you're analysing your own social psychology, if you like, and your position within the genre and also the aesthetics of that genre. So that's really, those are the four kind of key. What that suggests to me for practice research essentially is that it's key. One of the key dimensions of practice research is therefore translational. And to me, the translational aspects of practice, and this is where we really have the opportunity to do, because what it allows us to do is to answer questions about how we understand things like joy, or how we understand sorrow, or how we express and mediatize collective memory, and how we understand the sense of self expressed through media or through music. Those are really key questions that practice research can actually deal with in a way that text cannot. So to me, the translational dimensions of it are the key to unlocking the power of practice research across different genres of practice. And I think it kind of is actually a duty for us, if I'm being honest about it. I think there is a duty for practitioners who are doing practice research to really think about what the person on the other side of the world in a total genre of practice, yet within media or music or art, would really get from understanding their aesthetics, their tradition, and so on. So I'll come back to that. So one of the things, therefore, I think about this is that there's parts of media and music don't translate well into practice research. And I think thinking about these and debating these in different fora, and I've mentioned this idea of the canonical context, right, which we rely upon. So there's a canonical center ground to documentaries, films, video essays, performance, and so on. But there is no core genre of practice that works across all subdisciplines, spelt wrong, in media, journalism, and music. So it's an approach to me. Practice research is much more of an approach than a subdiscipline, if you like. So, I mean, you can position it any way you like, but I think positioning practice research as a methodological approach is a much stronger epistemologically than it is thinking through one specific practice in and of itself. So the real object of study, if we think about areas like, if we think about areas like aesthetics, if we think about areas like semiotics, if we think about media effects, if we think about any substantive area, post-colonialism and so on, are really questions about how media is used to mediatize and to move and to communicate messages and ideas about culture, people, and societies. So the subject, in my view, is very often, the research questions frame it this way as well. When you look at research grants and research papers, the object of study is very often not media and not music practice. There's not actually, the actual practice is not the object of study. It's the subject of the study, or it's the medium of the study. And that's a really key kind of thing, which people I know have talked about for a number of years now. So in my mind, then anyway, that means for many disciplines essentially that practice becomes, and has historically been, a means to understand or better understand mostly textual domains. And that, of course, is at the heart of the questions in rebellious research, and it's at the heart of the questions about practice itself. I mean, how do we position performance and somatic and embodied and non-textual knowledge as something that is useful and has a translational power? So, your music is not my music. So when I was thinking about this, I think the real prize here in the longer term, not the immediate term and not in a kind of referable sense, but the bigger prize here is actually changing the disciplines fundamentally, because there's a real challenge at the moment in the disciplines to understand plurality. So plurality is the big challenge, and that's, emerges from globalization and the privileges particular groups and so on. And we see this every single day. We see this in the identity politics, the dimensions of disagreement, which we have around the interpretation of media, the interpretation of social media, understanding of digital domains and performative domains like music, even sound, which has no words. So it's the most semantically ambiguous area of practice in a sense, because, sound with pictures is much more semantically specific than just pure sound. That even is now under scrutiny, and is particularly in relation to decolonization, which is a really important moment we are in, which is to recognize this growing sense of plurality. And so I think the sociological future involves much greater diversity. It involves greater atomization and polarization, as we're seeing across all these different domains, both public and private. And I think this is what I mean when I encapsulate it in the phrase, your music will not be my music, or your music is not my music. Is to really get a handle on the shorthand on this sense that relativism rests upon a shared sense of Western intellectual hegemony. And that has weakened substantially in the last 5, 10, 15 years particularly. And even in the last few years, we're seeing that so the hegemonic centering of disciplines shifting more and more and more. And that's where I think practice research has some really strong answers, because it allows us to access embodied knowledge and somatic knowledge, and to bring forward practice cross-culturally. So that is, to me, the big prize here for much more than just the sub-disciplines, if you like, or the approaches to practice. I really like this quote from Olga Tokarczuk's, the Nobel lecture she gave, where she says, "We're living in a reality of polyphonic first-person narratives, and we're met from all sides with polyphonic noise." I mean, I like it, obviously, because it's, you know, there's a musical metaphor in there, and it's sonic and it's audible, and so on. She's right when she says we are living in this really kind of first-person narrative, and it's polyphonic, and there's less and less consonance, if we like, in what we are hearing and watching and listening to, and how we understand that. So I think these touch points to me are important, because they allow us to share, you know, in a sense of where we're currently at and where we need to get to. So in that sense, if the future is more diverse and more comparativist, what I think we can do with practice about it, what's important about it is, I think everybody who does practice research understands this, whether or not they voice it the same way. But I understand that the most powerful thing about practice and performance is its power to bind us together at the moment of experience and feel a shared sense of emotion and solidarity. Now that's a huge prize, in the sense of when we're facing greater social division and atomization in social domains, the sense in which we are able to mobilize practice research to understand how we would interpret images like this and moving images like that, and how we understand film, and how we respond to and receive and respond to sound and film, and also voices as well. I think these are really important for us, because we can talk about that, and the prize is, if we talk about it interculturally, then we are moving some direction towards beginning to share more of a sense of solidarity. Robert Putnam, famous for the Bowling Alone book, and a sociologist of American life, I think really spoke something powerful when he says, you know, the challenge for us all is to create a new, broader sense of we. And we see this both politically and socially every day now. And I think that's what I'm trying to get across with this sense of your music is not my music, is that we need to actually address this challenge as academics, as filmmakers, as performers, as musicians, and so on. We have an opportunity here, I think, to address this sense of social solidarity. Yeah. So actually, I'm going to skip over this ref stuff, because I think it's probably been done to death, in a sense, you know, in some of the debates that we've had about practice research. You know, I think many of us, potentially quite a lot of us in this, in the discipline, would understand that we've got this sense of new knowledge, and new insights, which can be understood via practice. But I think there's an important aspect which I do want to mention, which is that not all practice is research. So, and I think people who make that argument, which is a circular argument, practice is research, research is practice, that's a very weak argument, and it doesn't really hold water. So we have to understand, what is it about the practice that really turns it from simply being practice to being research as practice? And I'll speak to that as well. So towards practice research in media and music. So I think for me, in a sense, what are the principles that would help us to do that? Documentation of practice research is key, to me anyway. And I know this is debated and there's not widespread agreement, but certainly for me, in the home disciplines of ethnomusicology and musicology and media studies as well, and also in some of the visual art stuff that I've read, and across some of the other domains of practice, the documentation is key to this sense of being able to provide research value to practice. And it's not just because of the musical examples that sound is semantically ambiguous and so on, but it also helps us to speak to the filmmaker in Oslo, to the documentary maker in Hyderabad, to the oboe player in Sydney, to the early music specialist in Boston. Okay, to me, the documentation is really critical, because once you recognize that most people don't have the understanding of your genre of practice, then it's incumbent upon you to have to be able to translate what the internal value system and the aesthetics really mean to people who are outside of your particular genre, from metal to movies. So performance alone is not research, but it can be the primary research method, which I'm sure about, in an active translational research which communicates new knowledge beyond the community of practice. And then that is essentially how I get to this point about practice research being really critical to the intercultural and wider influence upon the bigger disciplines of media studies, of music studies, and all the different flavors therein, and also to journalism, I think, as well. Journalism, I think, in some respects is a case apart because of its reliance on text. But there is also dimensions, I think, of journalistic practice which are not well recognized in the literature at the moment and not well understood, to do with practice, journalistic practice, which varies, of course, very widely across different domains. So practice and performance research necessitates an explicit focus on the intercultural communication, where translational research and performance means explaining the insider's aesthetics cross-culturally. So I break it down, particularly for music, into two broad areas of research practice. And that one essentially is this model of translational practice studies, which would include understanding core ideas about the aesthetics of your particular tradition. For music, of course, that includes understanding of time, pitch, and timbre. So, you can take something like pitch from music studies. It's really interesting. Pitch, timbre, time are all understood differently across different global traditions. Pitch is high pitch and low pitch. Though that's essentially understood in the brain through cognitive metaphor theory, where we use essentially a vertical metaphor to essentially understand high is high, low is low. But in other cultures, of course, pitch is understood differently. So pitch can be fat and pitch can be thin in other cultures. In some parts of Asia, pitch is fat, pitch is old and young. Pitch can be understood in different metaphors underlie pitch. So just to flesh it out a little bit, for instance, if you take something like our aesthetic understanding of pitch, well, we in Western countries understand pitch very much in terms of a vertical metaphor, but there's also spatial metaphors in other countries and other languages, which helps us to get a sense of how pitch doesn't necessarily always translate into gendered understandings of music, or into, for instance, different understandings about fear and comfort and so on, and reassurance and edginess. Those are areas of pitch in other cultures that are completely differently understood. So there's a good example, for instance, of taking something where if you can get at the underlying metaphor, the cognitive metaphor for that area, then you're able to really understand and explain cross-culturally the significance of pitch as it changes in our understanding and reception via metaphor, cognitive metaphor theory. The same thing is true of time. Time, I think, is particularly core and fundamental to practice. if you think about any practice itself, whether it's filmmaking, documentary, poetry, music, artistic, still life, you know, whatever it happens to be, electroacoustic even practice, time is fundamentally important. Rhythm is fundamentally important. Now, people like Theo van Leeuwen and David Machen and others have written about time and rhythm really usefully, I think, for media, social semiotics, to understand what the cultural significance of fast rhythms are vis-a-vis slower rhythms, slower speech, and how we cognize that and so on. But those, I think we're at a stage where we can move further than that now. So for instance, I am interested at the moment in understanding emphasis and accent in both music, sound, and in audiovisual stuff, particularly on YouTube, where you can really get a sense of cross-culturally how time, duration, and emphasis is used in different cultural traditions, and actually accessing it through practice in terms of experimenting with duration, rhythm, pitch, and so on. Accessing it that way allows you not only sometimes, I think, to potentially produce quite innovative practice, or sometimes not innovative practice, something that probably some practitioners out in the world wouldn't even want to watch or listen to. But it would allow you the opportunity to explore how we understand duration, emphasis, time, and so on. So I think one of the frontiers for us in practice research is to borrow from things like cognitive metaphor theory to understand container metaphors, spatial metaphors, verticality metaphors, and how these are put into practice in filmmaking, in musical performance, in audiovisual improvisation, in dance, in all sorts of forms of practice. So in that sense, I think we've got areas of translational practice that would involve both advocacy, historical research, cross-cultural analysis of mediatized aesthetics, and communication, of course, where we need help from the linguists, we need help from the social psychologists and so on to answer really interesting questions about communication. But we've also got this stuff which is analytically informed practice as research as well. Now, to me, that's all different from the substantive area of artistic research or practice research in media and music studies, which essentially begins and ends with practice, okay? Whereas I think the translational domain, to me, is answering questions about, you know, how things are communicated, how we understand things like time and pitch and so on, color, timbre and so on, accent. But the artistic research, I think, can do some of that as well, of course. But I think also it's also characterized by an understanding that we are actually doing things in terms of our practice that takes forward the practice itself. But we are able to communicate the advances and the new insights with an element of translation, which must include some kind of text. I think in order to communicate to people who are outside of your domain. But the interesting thing about it is that the actual research itself can flow clearly and live in practice, as well as it's well documented and communicated. And I think we really have the possibility there that will open up the possibility for us to really do a much more globalized understanding of practice and how it's understood across different ethnicities, races, and so on, and areas around the world. That's all I've got to say. I've got plenty of time for questions, hopefully. So I said I'd do it in 45 minutes or so. I got to. So thanks
Wonderful.
so much.
No, thank you, Simon. I was reflecting as you were talking. I was smiling all the time because every time I hear you talk, and for everyone who didn't know, we did with Simon last year at the MEXA conference a panel on similar matters, but every time I hear you talk, it resonates with me on such a deep level. And funny enough, this morning I gave a talk about similar things, and you literally just at the beginning of your talk summarized everything I was talking about this morning. So it's just absolutely fantastic to, to hear people like yourself just making me realize that perhaps I'm right about some of the things in terms of the way I think about creative practice research. So thank you so much. That's absolutely brilliant. So I'm gonna, use my privilege of person who chairs this meeting and just ask a couple of first questions and comments, and then I'm gonna open it for everyone else if that's okay. I mean, there's lots of things I would like to ask you really, and perhaps there'll be more a question of kind of asking you to perhaps comment and expand on certain elements of it. One of the things I really, really like about how you think about that creative practice research is this idea of effectively using any kind of creative practice, no matter what that is, as this kind of universal form of communication, which goes beyond, verbal kind of, format, and this idea of how it really can be applied, some kind of how learning we take from one discipline or another can be applied across different things. And that's really important because, of course, so many issues people have is like they just sit so comfortably within their own disciplines and they don't really look beyond. And obviously, there's some benefits of understanding your discipline. Of course, there is, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. But if we don't look beyond and across, and I know Carola will probably add something to that later, it's just really revealing. And obviously, in terms of thinking about your practice as research, and I completely agree with you, there are two different things. Not all the practice has to be research, and it's great if it isn't. It doesn't have to be, but if it is to be positioned as such, then it obviously responds to slightly different questions, really. And then this idea of translationality is just absolutely fantastic, because that's effectively what that is. Just and if we were to talk about academic concerns of what creative practice research is, it responds to that. It responds to how it's rigorous. It responds to how it's legitimate. It responds to how we can evidence that you just hitting all the boxes. But at the same time, is kind of intrinsically embedded within the practice itself. So it's not a separate artificial thing for us to do. It's just more about identifying these universal values of what we do. I'm sorry, it's like a very, very long summary / question. So I wonder if you'd like to maybe comment on that a bit more and just kind of or perhaps correct me if I did not, summarize it correctly. But I find it so important that you really pay so much attention to this, and especially because obviously you come, as you said, from like really strictly defined practice, and yet you're so open-minded when it comes to how it can be applied to so many different things.
Thanks, Agatha. I mean, I'm glad we agree. I'm glad we agree. I think that really, I mean, if I put it like this, if you've got a leak in the house under the sink, and you've got a problem, you phone a plumber, right?
Yes.
Right. So you phone the plumber comes around, the plumber fixes the leak, right? You don't phone a materials scientist to ask about the particular mix of copper and alloy in the pipes, right? And to me, that's the difference. That's the difference here, because a plumber isn't a researcher. A plumber is somebody who's doing something vocational and is hopefully good at it. And that is exactly the same argument, I think, across filmmaking, documentaries, musical performance, composition, artistic research in visual art and in other formats. Those people don't really need to work in a uni.
Exactly.
Right. But in order to do research and to be research active, you have to be able to contribute something which is changing the practice.
Exactly.
And that means really moving beyond simply the vocational practice itself, to me. So I think we're both very clear in that. I know others disagree with that, actually, because the other people, the position is much more that the practice in and of itself constitutes research because it's always already contributing new ideas and new knowledge. I actually don't really believe that to be true, because I think a lot of practice is quite derivative. not very original, and can still be effective and emotionally affective for people watching it or listening to it or participating in it. And I think that's a key difference, is to understand that, you know, you can still move people and produce really great work without doing research.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100%. And again, going back to a kind of feedback from my talk this morning, it's quite interesting, because I just to kind of provide it as a comment. So I worked with a group of people who were working across different disciplines. So I had musicians, I had filmmakers, I had photographers, and people working with all sorts of mixed media, and they were not really thinking before about their practice as research. There was a workshop part of it, and I just, you know, after explaining them this idea of how you can try to find your research question in your practice, they came up with so many amazing possibilities of how to use their respective practices to actually tackle real life, you know, questions and issues. And it was just absolutely fascinating. But I completely agree with you. And I really don't think it's I think that this kind of conflict comes from this idea that some people feel a bit offended that you have to talk a little bit more about, you know, what your practice is doing. But obviously, this is a completely different reason why you would be doing things. So, you know, you can be a great filmmaker, as you said, and really accomplished, and it could be absolutely fantastic. But then your audience is slightly different, perhaps, because if you're doing filmmaking-based research, one of your audiences, at least, will be fellow filmmakers or fellow filmmakers researchers. So that original contribution to knowledge you created will help them thinking about some other innovations in film. So it's not only your audiences which will watch your film anyway. So I think this is the difference as well. So it's about different audiences. And, you know, going back to your example with the plumber, well, obviously, if you are someone who's designing new materials, then perhaps you will call the researcher and ask about it. But if you just want to have your thing fixed, then obviously that's the way. So I really love this analogy, and I'm, you know, I'm 100% in agreement with you. But I think the reason we have this conversation, as I said, there's this kind of misconception that one is better than the other. They're just different things, even though they obviously sit under the same umbrella of creative practice, of creative practice, but not necessarily creative practice research.
I think one of the really interesting questions that comes out of it, I think, as well, if you're thinking epistemologically about this, is that actually there could be really poor practice that results in great research.
Oh, of course.
You know, and I think that's also interesting, because what we've tended to do is employ people in universities who are already really great in their chosen discipline. You know, who are already, maybe they've won prizes, or they've got an international reputation for their films or their photography or music. And I think that's good, because it allows students access to the very best practice and so on. So that's useful. But I think it's not the whole story. It's actually more difficult for those people, because they're going to be really good at that. And then they've also got to be really good at writing as well, and translating their practice as well for other audiences. So that's the real challenge. It makes it a very tough training, you know.
Absolutely. And just to kind of add one comment, because I know I'm hijacking this as always, but it's just because it's so fascinating. But, you know, you know what? My brain just froze. That I mentioned to everyone I was so tired. I had a really nice comment and just completely escaped it. I'm just gonna wait until it comes back. I'm so sorry. I'm just gonna. I know I wanted to say. I know it's not so bad. So you know, very often we're just being told, well, you know, you just have it so easy. You just do some kind of creative practice, and that's it. But to your point, it's actually double the work, because you have to be proficient in more than one thing. So you have to be proficient in your respective creative practice, and also in a way of communicating that in an academic way on top of it. So you're effectively doing both. So it's so much more accomplished. Not to mention that many creative practices are hyper complicated in itself, you know, and very often require for you to be an expert in definitely more than one things. And not to mention being a musician, that's, you know, the amount of works that goes into being a musician is just crazy. So I always feel like, well, obviously it's not just easy thing to do, and it's not so much easier than any other traditional sciences in that sense, because there's lots of work which gets into that. Okay, hands are going up, so I'm just gonna open up to questions. I have more questions for later if there's time, but James, you wanna go first? You wanna unmute yourself and go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. Simon, thanks very much for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I was just wondering, in terms of that concept of kind of moving away, I suppose, maybe from the more traditional artistic research, with, I suppose, the stability of your core canonical discipline, towards things like the translational practice studies. What would be your thoughts on, like, obviously, I suppose the dissemination and the documentation of things is very, very important, but in terms of all the, I suppose, the various charges that emerge from, like, say, from the preparation to a performance to the moment of exchange through to the post-performance period, all the various things that can be contained but ultimately can be hidden at point of exchange. I'm wondering, I suppose, even from a historical point of view, if someone has that collection of experiences, but the only thing, I suppose, that maybe is set in stone is a date and a time on what they played or how they played it, you know, but there's so much there that could contribute to I suppose, an understanding of a shared experience. What would be your thoughts on the best way to actually let that enter the public domain for the benefit of others?
I mean, okay, thanks for that, James. I mean, I think one answer to that question is about the kind of pragmatic stuff about documenting it and how do you present. Do you use an online exhibition? Do you use PowerPoint? Do you write up notes from rehearsals or whatever? And a lot of that's been done, you know, already. There's quite a lot of examples of that you can see out in things like the Journal of Practice Research and so on, or Journal of Artistic Research and so on. But I think the more interesting aspect of what you're asking is about what's worth recording and what's worth communicating. So to my mind, you know, one of the things that, you know, if I think about rehearsals, for instance, or playing music, you were going to do that as research, it really needs some kind of research objective or question at the start, and that is going to frame what matters. So what matters is, it might be, for instance, just to pluck out of thin air, it might be, for instance, that you're wondering how, let's say, performance practice can help social solidarity across ethnic groups, which is a big area of study in ethnomusicology and anthropology, and to some degree in areas like conflict studies and social semiotics as well, and in social psychology, in groups, out groups, bridging and bonding capital and sociology and so on. So I think in that sense, if you had something like a research question around that and you were using practice to answer it, you really need to be quite explicit about how you were going to use the practice to answer the research question. Now, there's lots of examples in relation to, say, for instance, cross-group social solidarity and division of evidence-based approaches to, say, surveys, fieldwork, participant observation, etc., etc. But for practice research, for something like that, you would need to combine, for instance, interviews with standardized kind of semi-structured interviews, with the video recordings of the rehearsals, personal interactions and so on, to get a real sense of how the actual practice itself changes as a result through time. So I think if I was designing a study around that, you know, and I'm just kind of spitballing here, but I'd be thinking about questions around how do we observe social interactions change through non-verbal communication over time, you know, and things like that would be the focus for that kind of thing. Whereas if it was much more a question about the artistic practice itself in terms of the actual outputs, which is what you're putting at the start of your question, the actual final outputs, well, then I think it's kind of easier in a way, because you can video record, audio visual, or you can textually record how it changes, and you can supplement that with interview evidence, focus group evidence, and so on, to understand exactly how the practice is manifestly changing people's personal perceptions of the practice itself. Do you see what I mean?
I do, yeah. I suppose the question really came about, like, I'm looking at this, I suppose, very much from an outsider on the health studies background, but there's, I suppose, so many phenomena there that fall victim to, I suppose, it's been called the quantification illusion. Things like, I suppose, very visceral, intense experiences. Take something like depression, where the essence of it is actually very, very difficult to communicate. There's a fantastic chasm there with things like ethnomusicology, and moving away more so from those kind of the traditional artistic research, more towards the broader translational practice studies, that actually there's a real, I suppose, a means to seek understanding there in a way that can't be achieved, as I say, from kind of my background. The health studies very much quantitative, wanting numbers and figures. There's a means there to really seek understanding through, whether it be through music, the experience of music, the conveyance of feelings, all through kind of the preparation, the point of exchange, all that kind of thing. So that's what I was wondering about, because I know myself personally, there would be things there that I suppose it's only really since coming to third level education that I would be looking at it from the slightly more research point of view. There's the experience of others that I know would be somewhat similar, but that's what I was kind of wondering about in terms of actually making it actionable or making something out of it,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You've got to speak to the audiences in a language they'll understand. So if it's health studies, or allied health or whatever, and you're using practice research in a sort of instrumentalized study, then you'd have to design that. I mean, the only thing I would say about that, James, is that where practice research is used in the service of really quite instrumental research questions about, say, therapeutic benefits or recidivism or social division or community solidarity and so on. Those are very instrumental kind of areas where traditionally practice has served a bigger master. And actually, I would say that, as a reviewer now, for things like grant applications or publications, I'm always looking to see, yes, but where is the question about the practice itself? And where does that sit in relation to the broader instrumental objectives of something that's mixed methods? Do you see what I mean?
100%.
Because it would be like practice researchers saying, yeah, I'm taking in Qualtrics and then Vivo here to do a study about practice research. It's totally inappropriate as a methodological thing, unless you are studying something which is where that method is useful alongside practice. Do you see what I mean? So it's about that, getting the right approach that fits the research questions, I would say,
Yeah, no, thanks very much.
Thank you, James, and thank you for your answer, Simon. Carola, would you like to go next?
Yeah, and again, Simon, thank you so much. Really found that absolutely fascinating, and I think I also am complete agreement with that kind of view on practices research, similar to also Agatha's view. Having said that, there's this need to put in words what new knowledge has actually been found, whether that's in textual written form or whether that's in documentary film form. And that brings, of course, film and music together. There's a real opportunity to put into a rigorous, referenced, backed up sort of filmic exploration of a line of inquiry of, for instance, a music practice, so there are these kinds of things. Having said that, being always kind of on the side of, are there examples which prove the counterpoint? And I have to admit that there are, I found one sort of composer, because I normally am completely with you, but my example of the opposite is actually Maurizio Cargill's, and I think it's just called Quartet. I need to look into it, but I experienced his performance of a Beethoven string quartet. And in a performance of 30 minutes, he basically dismantled the whole structure of that string quartet, because he sort of repeated sections and sections, uncovered harmonies by stripping away the structure of the music, and sort of brought out some elements, some harmonic elements, some rhythmic elements that you couldn't hear without really analyzing it. Now, of course, one could ask, is this analysis or is this research? But it is literally almost the only example where I could hear the new knowledge that was created through a sort of compositional practice. So that's my sort of one exception. But I think, yeah, go on.
I think that's a really nice example, actually, Carola, of your technical and insider knowledge giving you immediate sonic access to the research value of that piece. Now, I could watch one of Agata's films and probably pick up on some of the stuff, but there'd be a whole range, probably 90% of what she's trying to do would pass me by, because I'm just not familiar with the canonical center ground of what her work, in terms of the longer tradition in which she's working in film. And I think that's, so it still stands up to scrutiny, I think, that point about the emic kind of understanding, the insider understanding. Even
if I would suggest, I also do not understand the nuclear physics PhD. So there's a translational level that is always needed, and then it's a sort of range of translational levels. I'm not arguing against it, because it's literally the only example that I can find where I would suggest it's kind of holds up. Everyone gets a new insight on some level, but I do accept this notion of, if you want to make it clear to a different kind of audience, you would have to do that in words. But that translational effort is also needed for some of the PhDs who've been written for a particular community, and then it becomes quite a gradient. But I did want to just mention something else in relation to this notion of, you have the translational elements of a translational practice study and then artistic research. And you almost hint at that, but I just sort of wondered if you could unpack that for me, because sort of my view is that there is, of course, a research process where the theory always bounces off the practice. And when you do a sort of research project, quite often you pull along the what you call translational practice study, and that gives you something about your practice, and that gives you another insight into your translational practice, and that gives you something about the artistic practice again, and so that you sort of build upon each other and both influence each other and push each other forward. But so I wasn't quite sure if you understood it like that, or if you rather see it as two different types of methodologies even that do not inform each, or are more often than not set apart rather than informing each other.
No, that's really, I'm grateful for that. Yeah. I mean, in my head, the way I see it, in terms of the distinction I was making between translational practice research, right, and practice research or artistic research in music and media, the distinction in my head is that the former category, translational stuff, has research questions that are essentially about something like the example I was using of pitch or time or duration, or our understanding of sorrow, or our cultural competency in celebrity studies or media effects, something like that, where there's a question which is about the broader social dimensions or cultural dimensions, where practice research is used alongside and in the service of these broad research questions. Whereas in my head, the other arena is much more singular, if you like, which is where we have artistic research, or you could where essentially you're answering an objective in the research, which is purely artistic. So the actual, but it has to be framed in text. So you've essentially got, you might have an artistic objective, which is, can this instrument or this group of musicians, can they produce a new form that fits within this particular genre through practice? Can we get there through improvisation and practice together? And you could document that, how that goes with video and with audio and so on, and some text alongside it. But in the end, you're not serving a question about people, culture, and society. You're actually answering a question about artistic research. So in my head, really, the two domains, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that. I think, it's possible they could fold into one. But there is a clear distinction in my head where you see research which is about in and of the practice itself, and research that is answering a socio-cultural, political, or communicative question.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because maybe it's because many of sort of the PhDs that I supervised in the past, because it was music technology, music systems, and so we dealt with questions of, for instance, how do we perceive time in music? And one of the insights that I actually wrote up at one point was about that, when you actually look at systems, at that time, it was 15 to 20 years ago, there was a clear differentiation of the systems who were built by the Anglo-American cultures versus the ones which were built in the European culture. So one looked at time much more, how would you say, sort of hooked up into each other, almost incrementally, and the other one saw it linearly. So the systems on the Anglo-American side, you could speed up time. Think about the Gershwins. Think about, you suddenly had this compression of time and sort of the opposite of that. And on the European side, you had more recursive structures like the Stockhausens, where you have time within time within time. And when one shifted, it sort of blew up the whole composition. Yeah. And I think it was a different perception of time. But then we took that and said, okay, can we build a sort of compositional system where we sort of focus on one or the other, and that then created some sort of sounding outputs that more emphasized time in one of the other. So it has these questions, sociological questions of how do we perceive time in music in relation to time in real life, in reality, and then also the practice which try to create a creative artifact from the realization that came actually out of the sociological side. So I think there are plenty of lines of inquiry which are right smack in between these two sort of areas. And I have a feeling that, and this is of course where I get also really passionate, that the opportunity of what we've done in the creative field in terms of artistic practice and the methodologies that underpin that would really be useful for other areas as well. So we've seen that, of course, for instance, in living archaeology. Can we get insight by living a living history, and it gives that new knowledge on understanding how societies lived, 2,000 years ago, 500 years ago. So these kinds of practice-oriented approaches are actually useful, much more wider than just in artistic practice focus.
I totally agree. And I think journalism's a really interesting case here as well, because journalism in media departments and journalism departments, I think there's some really strong work still to emerge about journalistic practice and I mean, there's the big areas like kind of ethics and so on. But practice itself, how you actually go about doing journalism and how you communicate it, I think is potentially a really strong area cross-culturally. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at with this presentation, is to say exactly what you're saying there as well. I agree with that, you know, we can't take for granted things like our perception of time, you know, or our perception of this, that, and the next thing. We actually need practice. The big prize here is for us to really make explicit and translate through practice how these things are understood in different countries around the world, in different cultures. And I think I would definitely be an advocate for that, you know, as a good relativist, you know, in that sense. We're so impoverished in some respects, disciplines that emphasize really, you know, still emphasizing the same canonical texts that kind of come away with ideas that are really very specific to a particular moment. You know, and I'm thinking there about, say, for instance, even Birmingham, you know, the Birmingham School, or for instance, you know, the critical theorists of the mid 20th century in Germany and elsewhere, where you've got really quite specific ideas. I mean, for instance, you know, Marx is almost entirely useless for practice researchers, you know, today, because it's so embedded in that kind of structuralist approach to economics and to labor and so on. And I think, in fact, it's really interesting actually, because at the moment I was rereading some of the kind of critical theory stuff for some teaching that I was doing. And actually, there's some other people that are way more interesting in relation to practice research from the critical theory side. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I'm just agreeing with you that essentially, yeah, practice research, I think, has a real prize, which is to actually move media studies and music studies and various other forms of studies into a much more globalized discourse.
Yeah, I completely agree. I do have another question, but I would love to let someone else give it a go if there are other questions. But you mentioned the canon, and I think you mentioned at some point that you know, this notion of practice as research must involve textual output because there is no centrally agreed canon of musical works. And so I agree with the first part. I'm not sure it's because that there is no agreed canon. And this is sort of my thinking around that is actually based on this understanding. I've coined a sort of concept in my last book about University 3.0. So basically University 1.0 is we felt we owned the knowledge. This is pre-internet, you know, so the only place where I was teaching at Glasgow at the time, the only time where students could get knowledge was either from me or from the library or from getting books, but that's basically it. You know, that was knowledge transfer from the person who knew to others who didn't. And of course, typical large lectures were the pedagogies of that time, and workshops, of course. So 2.0 is, of course, University 2.0 is when disciplines expand. So at that time, there's an explosion of degree names, also in music and music technology, for instance, but it comes out of this notion that our knowledge domains become quite fragmented. So you don't have a corpus anymore. You don't have departments anymore, which have, you know, 20th century, 19th and 18th century, you know, medieval, Renaissance, ancient music. In 1.0, there was still an attempt to contain the corpus, the knowledge domain, in a boundaried space. In University 2.0, that's not possible anymore. But I'm always suggesting that we now go into 3.0 because, of course, now the knowledge society is all around us, which means that if I talk to my students about dithering, within a minute they get bored because they could just look that up in 2 seconds, you know, anywhere. So that then means that academics, pedagogues, and university professionals, they are not beholden to the knowledge as a central entity anymore. They are beholden to the environment that we create, design, curate, in order for everyone to bring knowledge into that domain and learn in that space. And that then means that the canon of knowledge becomes less relevant. Yes, we still need the learned academics or the learned scholars who can facilitate the learning process, but the knowledge and the canon of the knowledge, the disciplinary body of knowledge, is not the central element anymore because it's just all around us in a knowledge society and knowledge. So I think that's the element where I think I agree with this notion of it must involve a textual output, but I'm not sure that the reason for that is that there is no agreed central canon of musical works, because those in no discipline now could it be said that there's an agreed canon of knowledge that can be boundaried, because knowledge domains have expanded so much that they have become fragmented, and we have to curate, and we have to decide on, you know, what kinds of lines of inquiry we use. You know, there's also seemingly a reason why we say we are not going to create a hypothesis in that area. We are creating a line of inquiry, so a series of questions that also can shift, because the domain is now so fragmented. So I don't know what you think about that, and in relation to this notion of canon.
Well, yeah, there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
I mean, in some respects, I agree. In some respects, I disagree with that. It's interesting, isn't it? You're absolutely. I think everybody recognizes the curational dimension now of teaching. You know, where we're not asking students to learn stuff by rote anymore, or to reproduce stuff that was, you know, formulated and agreed in the late 19th century. So we are in a place, I think, where we are definitely facilitating learning and all of that stuff, you know, which is quite well worn. However, at the same time, though, you know, the problem, of course, that we've all faced, I mean, thinking about students, for instance, is that as those canons of authoritative knowledge have, you know, dissolved in sense of boundaries, they're still there, but the problem we've got is that we are now facing you know, students who, for instance, will cite sources as authoritative which have no real basis or intellectual tradition, and therefore quite often are citing stuff which is utterly useless, you know, in the sense of internet sources or so on. And so in a sense, part of the project, I think, which is going to be really interesting with AI, is essentially the way in which AI and the algorithmic movement at the moment is essentially establishing a new canon of knowledge based upon, you know, the disappearing internet, you know, and what people, you know, by consensus agree is the canon. So I think this is, as you say, a really interesting moment, because we're in a position now where, you know, the artificial intelligence is actually shoving back to us the answers that it thinks we want to hear through large language models. And actually, sometimes when if you ask ChatGPT or you'll ask AI a question about your disciplinary knowledge, where you've read the stuff and you've read the Habermas and you've read the Marx and you've read all the kind of the Birmingham School or whatever, or you're familiar with Stuart Hall, and you go back and you've read all that stuff and you say, right, and you ask it a question about representation or about, let's say, semiosis or something like that, and it will give you back some stuff on that answer that you just think, like, what on earth is this all about, you know? Or you see stuff in essays that you're like, where on earth is this coming from? And you look at the reference list and it's like some bizarre website that somebody stuck up 15 years ago, you know, which was a pet project of somebody. You know, where they're not critically aware. So I suppose the point I'm making is it's about critical awareness of those intellectual traditions. And I think also I would turn it on its head, Carola, and say, you know, we have got a real issue with the AI now, which is creating this new non-human canon.
Yeah, gosh, I'm not sure if I would call it a canon, but yeah, it's an issue. Yeah, I did question at some point AI about a quote that I was using, and it quoted back to me a book which I supposedly have written that I have no knowledge of that I've ever written. So it might
well, yeah, and the hallucination thing. Well, that was the Graham Meikle did a fantastic keynote at MEXA last year, where he asked AI for his biography, and it was fascinating actually how much he got wrong in his biography. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do in media.
Yeah, absolutely.
So fascinating, honestly. So many things we could continue talking about. So I have another question, but let's see if there's anyone else in the audience who would like to ask something before that. Well, I'm gonna jump at my opportunity very, very gladly. So this is actually a conversation you and I had very informally on the way to the pub after the conference last time. I don't know how much of this you remember, but you mentioned this today, like this idea, like, you know, you've been practicing music for, you know, God knows how many years since early childhood, and then you end up in academia, and then you kind of you know, give up your practice in order to eloquently write about it to some degree. You know, I mean, you give up to some degree in order to write about it and kind of focus on what it means and all the kind of knowledge production. And I remember we had these conversations, and I was like, well, exactly what happened to me. And I feel very frustrated about it. I had this idea of a dystopian sci-fi film I really want to make, because I really want to start making fiction films as a form of research, because they don't exist very much. But I wonder if you do have any recommendations for all of us here in a meeting today for, like, how can you possibly still just find time and prioritize your practice? Because I personally really gradually start feeling a bit hypocritical, because I talk so much about creative practice, and yet I'm becoming more and more distant from my practice. And it's not that I don't know how to do it, but obviously I don't practice as much as I would like to, mostly because I have no time. And I find it problematic, and I know that at some point I just really have to stop everything else, and in whichever way I can do it, and just get back to my practice so I can keep talking about practice. So I wonder if you could have any, you know.
Well, very simple. You know, I totally feel your pain, and I agree, because I feel the same pain, Agatha. One of the really simple things I've done over the last few years is start playing with friends again on a Friday night. And it's actually amazed me how important this has become to me. You know, if I don't get to that on a Friday night, I really struggle, actually, you know, to think I've let that go past another week, you know, but generally I'm making it every Friday night. Now, for me, it's slightly easier because I'm playing music with other people, right? So that's kind of a shared communal thing, and there's you know, you can go along and be part of it, and it happens whether I'm there or not. So it's quite good, I think, to do it with friends, you know, and to do it collectively and get a wee group of people that are interested in doing the same thing. And that's one of the ways in which I've come back to it, you know. And actually, I have a really nice invitation at the moment to play in a recital in the summer, and some other stuff to do again, which is also making me practice. So there's the hard graft bit of doing it, you know. For musicians, it's always like, you know, these don't really work as well as they used to, you know. So I have to get back to actually using them again, you know. And I think just very small things like playing on a Friday night, you know, looking at some repertoire and saying, I'm going to learn that this week is, for me, is what really works. But then framing that into a more research question about the practice is difficult, but it's doable in the sense that if you can build it into your teaching, or, you know, that really helps too, I find.
That's a great answer, because it really is, I think, at the end of the day, boils down to this idea of priority. So you have to basically prioritize it in some way or another at some point, because otherwise just, you know, it goes away. That's a great answer. So Tim is typing something in the chat. So I wonder, Tim, if you just prefer to unmute yourself and ask a question. And if not, Alex, just go ahead and we wait for Tim to type his question. Yeah.
Right, this isn't really a question. This is just to say thank you for a very, very informative hour and a bit. Yeah, I've just got a lot of thinking to do about what you've been saying and apply it to what I'm doing in my research, which I will now go, sit down and do it.
It's a fantastic comment. I love it, Tim. That's just that's what we should all do after this talk. That's just brilliant. Thank you so much. That's a great comment. Thank you. Alex,
Thanks
do you want to go with your question?
I just found that those last points really fascinating, and thinking or asking a way of how to embed these things is something I've found since hopping over the fence and starting to work as a lecturer, is this idea of skill erosion, of practice erosion, of not doing the thing that got me in the chair in the first place through all the other time vacuums that the universities create for us. And I wondered, this is what makes me interested in this as a potential avenue of using it as a way to formulate time and projects to force yourself into practice. How have you seen any things of that in this kind of arena, of this almost, for a kind of crude way, as finding of it as an excuse to do practice?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I did last year was to get a little bit of money so I could pay some other musicians to record a kind of EP of stuff. So one of the questions that I'm kind of thinking about at the moment is for in the practice research domain is to do with the traditionality, essentially, or the traditionalness of what's considered to be excellent and not derivative composition in traditional music. And that's really interesting because you can both do that on your own, because you can compose stuff and you can write about how naff it is, or write about how good you think it is, but then you have to invoke all of your knowledge that you already have about other pieces that people have written before you and other composers and so on. And I've done a bit of that, where I've kind of written stuff, and I've also then commented on it in a very reflexive kind of way. Again, that's useful only in the sense that it gives you an insight into what I think. And I think the real challenge for practice research is to kind of get a sense of what other people think as well. So the next stage for that would be for me to then go out and potentially ask people what they think about these compositions, and to record their reactions to it. And you can do that you can do that with any kind of media. So there's that. But I also think using it in your teaching can help too, because you can involve students in your research, definitely, and that could be through any number of different ways, through a module, through an inter-university project where you're collaborating with other people at another institution, or overseas. Overseas is great because I've not done this, but I like the idea of it, but it means that you get access to a whole different set of values about what constitutes good practice, and they come into collision, and you can observe that collision.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think you've just both given me an idea for something I should probably organize at some point, and I have a feeling you're going to be invited to participate in discussions, Simon. This idea of finding time for this kind of things, and finding ways to incorporate it into all the other things you're doing, because it's just really important, and clearly a struggle for everyone. But I just wanted to say there's lots of really amazing comments in the chat. People just say how amazing your session was and how grateful they are. So I just really want to extend that and just say thank you so much. It's genuinely wonderful to have you here, and I just really like it how everything you said really resonates with how I feel about creative practice research, and it gives me hope that this discussion will lead to some practical changes in the way community functions, because obviously we need to make sure that things are improving, getting better and easier for us, that what we do is understood again, without us having to all the time just justify why we do what we do, and so forth. So thank you so much for all your work, you know, around that topic, and just being so open-minded and universal. And thank you so much for your time and expertise this afternoon. It was just wonderful to have you here.
It's a great privilege to be asked. Thank you so much, Agatha, and everybody who came along.
Lovely, fantastic. Thank you so much. So just a kind of 2 seconds announcement. So this was our penultimate session this academic year. So there's going to be one more with Ian Brown from Staffordshire University next month, and then we break for summer. So thank you so much. And obviously I'm going to upload it to the YouTube channel as soon as I possibly can, probably tomorrow. But yeah, thank you once again, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.